Hello, good morning, Monday morning, here we go again. I have to say I am happy to be here to read to you from Slaves with Isabella for Black History Month. I've been working on my new book this morning. I think I might have said before, I'm really close to the end. I did a decent bout of work yesterday because my husband took our kids out for a good part of the day. So I did lots of work on it yesterday, and I'm racing to get to the finish line before October half term. But this morning it's just, the trouble is I've been here before. I know my instinct is right, and I know I'm going to have to up the drama. And the only thing I can think is, well, I'll get to the end and then I'll come back and sort it out. That's the thing about writing something. I don't think anybody gets it right first time. I'd be amazed if there's anybody who does. You always have to come back and have another go. So if you find writing hard, it's, I do too, and it's my job. So you shouldn't be put off or discouraged by feeling like you need to go back and sort things out or correct things or make them better. Because actually once you've created something, then you can really make it good. You have to go through the act of creation first. That's what happened with all of these books. We haven't yet got to the paragraph I think I mentioned in a much earlier, one of the earlier podcasts. I was saying to you that there was a paragraph I had rewritten somewhere between 25 and 40 times. I don't even know how many times I rewrote it. We haven't got to that chapter yet, but it's coming up in not too long. Anyway, in the meantime, Joe has got back to Lucy's time, and he's landed in the street right outside Lucy's house. She has realised it must be him, but she doesn't know who he is. She just knows he's not Josiah. Josiah de Courson, her cousin, who he was pretending to be and who did turn up. Josiah de Courson, meanwhile, has left, which is why Joe is able to be here. But now Joe's turned up, and Lucy's brother Peter thinks that Joe is him, and is very unhappy, transparently unhappy about it. And Lucy says, I suppose it comes of knowing he'll have to put up with the two of you again. The two of me? And she explains that her father has brought her aunt and her aunt's son, her other cousin, back from Jamaica. And the name of this other cousin is Tobias. Tobias, Joe exclaimed in dismay. Oh no, not Tobias. Chapter 8. What do you mean, not Tobias? You don't know him, do you? Joe couldn't find the words. It felt so unfair to have his hopes dashed so soon. Why had he let himself believe that Tobias wasn't here? He should have known better. At last he said tightly, Do you remember, when I was here before I asked you if there was someone called Tobias? So you did, Lucy said. I'd forgotten. And there wasn't then, but there is now. She was clearly intrigued. The thing is, Joe went on, Tobias is always in your worlds. His heart was in his shoes. This wasn't the best place to start explaining who he was, but he had to begin somewhere. My worlds? Lucy frowned. What on earth are you talking about? I'm from the future, Joe said. Before she could interrupt, he went on quickly. The St. Christopher I gave you as I disappeared, that's the key. It takes me back to different times in the past, and you're always there. So is your family, but so is Tobias. As he'd expected, Lucy looked at him with utter incomprehension. He sighed. It was always like this. In fact, it was remarkable that she ever accepted him at all. The only comfort was that at least this time she wouldn't be angry with him for pretending to be somebody he wasn't. He took a deep breath. I've met you before, he said, all of you, but you won't remember me. You never do. It doesn't matter really, it's not important. For the first time ever, he wondered why he'd bothered to tell her. Perhaps next time, if there was a next time, he should keep it to himself. It probably wouldn't change anything. For several seconds, Lucy was silent. Then she said, "Prove it." Joe thought for a moment. The last 3 times he'd had to persuade her, he'd used the fact that he knew about the death of her younger brother years ago. He might as well try the same approach now. "You had a brother called Francis who died," he said. She stuck out her chin. "No, I didn't." "Perhaps not Francis then, but something similar? Freddie? Frank?" "No." Joe was taken aback. "Are you sure? I think I'd know." Joe hesitated. This was absolutely not what he'd expected. "Well then," he pressed on, "you also had a sister who died, called Anne." "So what? Of course you know about her. You used her easel after all." Joe faltered. "All right. What about your older brother and sister, Matthew and Cecily? Both of them died too. Nobody has mentioned them, have they?" A strange expression appeared on Lucy's face. Joe watched her apprehensively. "How did you know about them?" Lucy's voice shook. "Why wouldn't I?" Joe asked. "I've met them several times. I knew them. Not very well, but well enough." "You couldn't have. My mother has lost several babies, 2 of them before I was born. Matthew was 4 months old and Cecily was just 6 weeks. They would both have been older than Peter. And there was another baby too, stillborn when I was little. I don't think he even had a name. I only know about any of them because my mother mourns them on their birthdays, just like she mourns Anne and Thomas." Joe was confounded. 4 months, he repeated. 6 weeks? But Matthew was a grown man. He was supposed to... Joe broke off. He'd been going to say that Matthew had been supposed to sail on the Mary Rose when it sank. But that was another world. In this one, he and Cecily hadn't even reached childhood. Joe felt a pang of sadness at the thought of the people they should both have become. He'd liked them. He knew what had been lost in a way that Lucy couldn't. "What do you mean, Thomas?" he asked instead. "I thought he was at home with his nurse." "Not that Thomas," Lucy said. "Didn't you realise? He was about 3 when you were last here, wasn't he?" Seeing Joe's confusion, she corrected herself. "Not you, of course. Josiah. The first Thomas was 3 when Josiah was last here. Sorry, you do look so like him. I still can't keep you apart in my head. Anyway," she sighed, "Thomas died a 1.5 years ago of smallpox. Peter and I were inoculated, but then my mother heard of a child who died from the treatment, so Anne and Thomas weren't. They died within 2 weeks of each other." Joe rubbed his forehead. He hadn't realised that anyone knew about inoculation in the 1700s, but that wasn't the most baffling thing. "You do still have a little brother called Thomas, don't you?" he asked. "It's not the same child," Lucy said. "Baby Thomas isn't yet quite a year old. My mother felt him move inside her on the day the first Thomas died, so she gave him the same name." They walked on in silence for a while. Joe tried to imagine his parents having 8 children and losing 5 of them. People in Lucy's time must be so frightened when their children got ill. Presently he asked, "What date is it today?" Lucy was bewildered by the change of subject. "The 21st of April, she said. "Why?" "And what year?" 1792. But I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Not the year, maybe," Joe answered, although he felt private satisfaction that he'd worked it out more or less right. "But I do know that you must have had a birthday since I was last here. It's at the end of March, isn't it?" He felt proud that he'd managed to dig this out of his memory. Lucy had only ever mentioned her birthday once, when he had met her at Old Wardour. "That's right." She still sounded guarded. "But of course you'd know. We did celebrate it after all." "Not with me, remember? I was here in February, and you and I definitely didn't talk about birthdays then. We didn't even talk about how old you are, although I know you're 12, like me." Lucy frowned. I still don't see how it's possible that you already know me, she persisted. Joe smiled ruefully. It isn't possible for someone to disappear into thin air, is it? But you saw me do that too. Her brow furrowed even more. How did that happen? She asked. I'm not completely sure, Joe said. Usually it's when I'm in danger that I get pulled back into my own world. This time I think it was the shock of seeing my double. Josiah does look like me, doesn't he? Lucy grinned. It was weird, wasn't it? You can see why we thought you were him when you arrived. But why did you go along with it? Why not say who you were from the start? And have a conversation like this with everyone, right at the beginning? Joe laughed. No thanks. It's bad enough now with just you. Anyway, Josiah and I have almost the same name. I'm Joe, short for Joseph. When Hannah called to me in town, I misheard her. By the time she'd swept me up, it felt too late to say anything. Lucy nodded. It was funny in a way, she said. How bemused everyone was when the real Josiah arrived. There he was, complaining loudly about not being met at the quay, when everyone thought he'd been with us all day and had just come in from a walk. And of course his accent was very noticeable, whereas you didn't have an accent at all. Joe couldn't help but smile. That's because I'm not French. So what did they think had happened? My mother put it down to Josiah being overtired. That didn't make sense, of course, but how else could she explain it? She hadn't seen you vanish, so it didn't dawn on her that you and Josiah were two different people. And what did Josiah think? He saw me, didn't he? He was looking straight at me. I never asked him. I decided to pretend nothing had happened. Maybe he put it down to being tired as well. He never mentioned it. So what do we do now? Well, I think it would be better if we didn't tell the rest of the family that you're not Josiah. What about Peter? Joe protested. I hate it that he dislikes me so much. Lucy tutted in mock disapproval. In that case, you should pretend to be someone nice next time. You know, it was obvious within seconds that the real Josiah was the same as he'd always been. My mother couldn't hide her astonishment at the change that seemed to have come over him. What do you mean? Well, you'd been so polite and friendly while we drank tea and over lunch. You might not have said very much, but you seemed glad to be there. Then we went out for a walk together, and as far as my mother could see, you became rude and demanding from the moment we got back. By the way, are you sure you don't want your St. Christopher? She pulled it out again from inside her coat. Not now, Joe said. It's how you call me here, by holding it and thinking about me at the same time as I think about you. She looked dubious. Does that work? It did today, didn't it? That's exactly what happened. They had walked all the way to the other side of the park while they were talking and had looped round back to where Peter had left them. Now they started back towards Lucy's house, retracing their earlier steps. Anyway, Joe said, it sounds like quite a bit has happened since I was last with you. Why don't you tell me about it? Lucy nodded. You got the hint that my father coming back from the West Indies. Sorry about the idiotic question, Joe said sheepishly. Never mind, Peter's probably forgotten already. In any case, I think you knew that my father went out to deal with his brother's affairs. The plantation? That's right. My uncle had left it to my Aunt Catherine and my cousin Tobias. So why did they come back with your father? Aunt Catherine didn't want to stay on out there, Lucy said. She never liked Jamaica. Tobias wants to take the plantation over, but he's only 17. He'll have to be 21 before he's legally allowed to. I bet he's delighted to be here then. Lucy glanced across at Joe, then realised he was joking. He's furious, she chuckled. He hates England. He was sent to school over here when he was 10, but he ran away and got himself on a ship back to Jamaica. Wow, that's pretty determined. Yes, wasn't it? Anyway, as you can imagine, our house isn't the easiest place to be at the moment, with him like a permanent thundercloud. And it's even worse than it might have been because the servants are all out of sorts as well." "Why?" Joe asked. "Is Tobias rude to them?" Lucy waved a hand. "Of course he is. So was Josiah. But it's not that. They're used to that sort of thing. No, it's because they've had to make way for 4 more people in the house, as well as my aunt and cousin. My father brought a Negro manservant back with him, plus 2 Negro children and their nursemaid. All 4 of them were slaves on the plantation." Joe caught his breath. The children were slaves too? Lucy nodded. "Their mother was a slave, so they were born slaves. Rose is 7, Billy is 4. He was just starting to work when my father arrived." "A 4-year-old slave?" Joe exclaimed. Dad had said children were taken as slaves, but Joe realised he hadn't quite believed him. "Was your uncle a good master?" Lucy pressed her lips together. "I don't think so. But of course, if you don't beat a slave, they won't work." It sounded as though she was repeating something she'd been told. "And without slaves to work the plantations, we wouldn't have sugar." Joe paused to look out over the city, glowing in the late afternoon sunshine. "You wouldn't have half of this either," he said, more to himself than to her. They reached the top of Park Street and walked down it together without speaking. The water that had been streaming down the road had dwindled to a series of trickles, but there were deep channels between the paving stones where it had passed through. As they came to Lucy's house, she said, "Remember now, Joe, who is not Josiah. French accent, surly and unfriendly, just polite enough that they'll take you back. They won't be pleased to see you, either the servants or the family." She pulled the bell pull. At once the door opened. "Miss Lucy?" Morley bowed. "And Master Josiah again?" He didn't bow to Joe. Joe did his best to look sullen. If Josiah had been rude to the servants, he shouldn't explain himself to them either. "I'll tell the mistress you're here." "Thank you," Joe said automatically. He felt Lucy nudge him. Perhaps he shouldn't even have said that. But Lucy hissed, "Accent." A few moments later, Lucy's mother came out into the hall. "Josiah," she exclaimed, "this is unexpected. Did your ship not sail?" Joe took off his hat and bowed. "It did, madame," he replied in a voice that he hoped might pass for French. "But we ran aground in the night. I was sleeping, but I had a dream that I was being punished for my ingratitude. You have been most kind to me, and I have been ungrateful. When I woke and found the ship aground, I knew it was a sign that I should not have left." Joe's heart was pounding. Ellen's face gave nothing away. "If you will allow me to stay with you once again," he pushed on, "I will try to be more, how do you say, appreciative." He bowed again. Lucy's mother blinked. "Of course," she said. Joe held his breath, waiting for her to say more. Surely she would identify him as an impostor. His accent sounded terrible, even to his own ears. But Ellen went on, "Nobody goes through life without needing a second chance. You're welcome to stay, as before. What of your luggage?" Joe tensed. "It will have gone with the ship, won't it?" Lucy suggested. "No matter," Ellen said briskly. "We will lend you what you need for now. Perhaps your mother will return the trunk. I wrote to her yesterday to inform her of your sudden departure. I shall write her again and tell her you've changed your mind." No, I will do it," Joe said hastily. "I owe her an explanation." It would cause even more trouble if Ellen wrote to say Josiah was still here when he was actually back at home. "Very well." Ellen turned to Lucy. "Where's your brother?" "He saw Henry Cunningham in the park. Josiah had already joined us, so Peter went to speak to his friends." "Avoidance," Lucy's mother said shortly. "Josiah, make yourself at home again." She went back into the parlour and closed the door behind her. Joe let his breath whistle out. "Thank goodness that's over," he muttered. What now? What now, indeed? Surely they're going to smell a rat. He is so not French. But we don't know, do we? Well, I know. Of course I know. Although I don't remember as clearly as I might. I wrote this book a few years ago, and it's funny how the details do slightly drift in your mind. Anyway, we'll find out tomorrow when we've got chapter 9. Next week, so we'll have 9 tomorrow, that's Tuesday, 10, 11, 12. Then we'll have 5 chapters left to go. And actually, next week I'm going to do some double bills, because otherwise we're not going to finish this in time for schools in Wiltshire, because in Wiltshire we break up on, well, my children break up on Wednesday, my primary school children. So yes, I might even do a double bill on Friday and then again on Monday. I'll decide later in the week. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.